Next is Vice Chair Leandro Leviste.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the entire economic team for all of their diligent work in preparing the materials for today, and thank our dear family friends who are also here and whom I would like to address some of these questions to. First of all, I would like to confirm that based on the economic team's presentation for 2026, there are projections for approximately 5 trillion in government revenues and 6.6 trillion in government expenditures, resulting in approximately 1.6 trillion of a deficit. So in this case, conceptually, if we have identified approximately 200 billion pesos in wasteful spending, we could either reduce the deficit, reallocate spending, or lower taxes. May I confirm if this is conceptually correct?
For budget deliberations, it is the prerogative of Congress to cut the budget. The only limitation is that you cannot increase the budget, but you can cut the budget.
Yeah, so I would just like to confirm that the economic team would not have an objection to cutting hypothetically identified wasteful spending and reallocating this to more productive spending.
That is correct.
And also cutting such spending and reallocating some of it to tax cuts, as long as this would not increase the deficit.
Tax cuts will not be part of the deliberations of the budget. That will be a separate matter altogether.
Yes, I would just like to confirm that conceptually, if the deficit does not increase, that the economic team would not have an objection to reducing wasteful spending and then reducing taxes.
In 2027, you will still have a deficit. In 28, you will still have a deficit. In 29, you will still have a deficit. So it will be very, very difficult to cut taxes.
The premise of the question is that the deficit provided here is 1.6 trillion, which I believe would be approximately 6% of GDP. So if we maintain a deficit of approximately 6% of GDP, then theoretically we could cut taxes as long as we stay less than 6% of GDP.
My advice is that when the deficit gets down to 3%, then we can start talking about cutting taxes.
I do not object to the target of having a deficit of less than 3%. So we take it from the economic team that if we can reduce the deficit to less than 3% of GDP, then we can target cutting taxes.
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My next question is that the President has indicated that flood control projects are a possible source of corruption, and the 2026 NEP includes over 250 billion pesos in flood control projects. Perhaps the other members of the economic team could also comment on this, who have worked closely on the preparation of the NEP. So I would just like to ask if, from a fiscal perspective, the economic team has any objection if the House allocates much of this 250 billion pesos plus of flood control projects, let's say, for the sake of argument, 200 billion pesos of it, to, let's say, half education spending and half lower taxes, noting that the economic team had also mentioned earlier that we should aim first to lower the deficit to 3% of spending before we talk about lowering taxes. I guess the first part of that question is if there is any objection from the economic team of reallocating much of the flood control budget towards education spending.
Again, we'd like to repeat, Madam Chair, that the executive proposes the budget and then we leave it to the Congress whether you think it's wise to cut the flood control project and move it to education. But we welcome such because, again, the theme of our budget for next year will be really to increase our investment and spending in education.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for the increase in the budget for the Department of Education this year, which I believe deserves credit as being true to the spirit of it being an education budget. The bulk of the budget, of course, is in various things that are already provided for under various laws, but the provision for construction of new classrooms is still approximately 13 billion pesos. Is that correct, Madam Chair?
Yes, Madam Chair.
And the DepEd has stated that it has the absorptive capacity to deliver more classrooms, but that the 13 billion peso figure is the result of the so-called fiscal space available. And therefore, I would just like to ask the economic team, Madam Chair, if there's any objection if the House reallocates the flood control budget to increase the 13 billion pesos that has been allocated to new classroom construction. I was earlier proposing that it partly be allocated towards tax cuts and classrooms, but for the sake of argument, considering that the DepEd has stated there is a 165,000 classroom shortage, if we could allocate, let's say, 200 billion pesos to construct, let's say, 50,000 classrooms.
As long as the Department of Education can utilize fully the added allocation for the construction of classrooms, that will be okay.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I believe that the other members of Congress would be supportive because the President's general sentiments from his State of the Nation address is that he would like to close the gap on this classroom shortage, and that it seems to be a much more wise use of taxpayers' money than flood control projects. And I would like to ask then if once we have established these other pressing expenditures and we have reduced the deficit to 3% of GDP, if the economic team would have any objection to us lowering taxes, specifically the value-added tax of 12% down to 10%, considering that, if I'm not mistaken, the VAT brings in approximately 700 billion pesos for the coming year of revenues, and the reduction of the VAT from 12 to 10 might result in, let's say, 100 billion pesos of revenue losses. We might not necessarily be talking about fiscal year 2026, but we could just talk hypothetically of one of the upcoming years. If the economic team would have any objection to Congress reducing the VAT from 12% to 10%, if this would still keep the deficit within 3% of GDP.
For as long as the deficit is roughly 3 and your debt to GDP ratio is maybe below 50%, I would not object to lowering taxes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I believe that if we find other wasteful spending in government, including in some of the Department of Public Works and Highways as projects, then we could bring the country's deficit to less than 3% of GDP and still lower the VAT from 12% to 10%. And I believe that that would be a great legacy of the 20th Congress if we can be the Congress that lowers the VAT from 12 to 10%.
In addition, just for information to the committee, if the VAT is 12% and if our economy is 30 trillion, then we should be collecting 3.6 trillion, right? It's 12% of GDP. So in effect, if we're only collecting, frankly speaking, 1.4 trillion, then the effective VAT rate is actually even below 6%. In effect, the effective rate is something like 5%. So that's where we are today. Just wanted to pass that information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. And if I could ask a last question to our fellow advocate for the development of Southern Tagalog and the province of Batangas. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Secretary and Madam Chair, Calabarzon contributes approximately 15% to our country's GDP. And while there is no breakdown in what percent of the total NEP is allocated towards which regions, at least for the budgets allocated per region under the Department of Public Works and Highways, if I'm not mistaken, Calabarzon has approximately 6% of the total budget allocated under the Department of Public Works and Highways. Or my apologies, 10%. There's approximately 180 billion pesos allocated for certain regions and approximately 18 billion pesos allocated towards Calabarzon. Would the economic team have any comment on whether it would be wise for Calabarzon and regions in general to get a percentage of government spending that is commensurate to their contribution to GDP?
The matter is that since a lot of the wealth is created in Calabarzon, we are subsidizing other regions in the country.
would the economic team have any comment on moving that the budget to be approved by Congress be more commensurate to the contribution to GDP, which would mean that every district in Calabarzon have an increase of approximately 50% from what has currently been provided for in the 2026 NEP?
That may not be in the Philippine Development Plan, but that is always a prerogative of Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Leviste.